Alright. Time to send out notification for... Time to send out the thing that I'm live right now. By the by, if anybody hears any background noise, my parents are watching TV downstairs, and the walls in this house are incredibly thin. Okay. Don't really know if anybody's gonna show up for this one, but... You know what? It's fine. Alright. Let me get this shit set up real quick. Got a grand total of 0 viewers. That's... amazing. I think I'll probably wait until people start trickling in. But yeah. Let's see. Alright. I guess I'll explain for anybody that's gonna be watching back on this. Last night, I started on Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, which is kind of fucking unreadable. And so, what I wanted to do, basically I'm going down a reading list devised by President Sunday to kind of sort of understand Deleuze and Anti-Oedipus. Let me put my iPad on a charger real quick. And the book that he recommended that we start with was Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, particularly the 2 prefaces and the chapter on the chapter on the transcendental aesthetic. Now I read the Penguin edition of Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, and that was pretty much unreadable. So what I got right here is something I got from Barnes & Noble today, the Basic Writings of Kant. Look at that cover. And ain't that a nice cover? And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through and read the book. Basically analyze it as I go along. It's going to be tough. It's probably going to take me a while, but you know, streaming stuff's not going to be easy. Who knows? I should have probably gotten the Dono link, but you know what? Fuck it. We'll just do this raw. So, let's do this. Preface to the first edition, 1781. Our reason, Vernunft, has this peculiar fate that with reference to one class of its knowledge, it is always troubled with questions which cannot be ignored, because they spring from the very nature of reason, and which cannot be answered because they transcend the powers of human reason. So right off the bat, I'm liking the clarity of this translation a lot more, and I can more so pick up what Kant's saying with this translation. He's basically saying that the ability that we have to reason is always basically tied to these questions that we can't ignore by dint of us being human, but that we can't answer because they are beyond our ability to answer. Nor is human reason to be blamed for this. It begins with principles which, in the course of experience, it must follow, and which seem sufficiently confirmed by experience. With these again, according to the necessities of its nature, it rises higher and higher to more remote conditions. But when it perceives that in this way it remains forever incomplete, because the questions never cease. It finds itself constrained to take refuge in principles which exceed every possible experimental application, and nevertheless seem so unobjectionable that even ordinary common sense agrees with them. Thus reason becomes involved in darkness and contradictions, from which no doubt it may conclude that errors must be lurking somewhere, but without being able to discover them, because the principles which it follows transcend all the limits of experience and withdraw themselves from all experimental tests. It is the battlefield of these endless controversies which is called metaphysics. So Kant is basically explaining the origins of metaphysics. He's saying that, let's start again from the first sentence. Nor is reason to be blamed for this. Nor is human reason to be blamed for this. It begins with principles which in the course of experience it must follow, and which seem sufficiently confirmed by the experience. With these again, according to the necessities of its nature, it rises higher and higher to more remote conditions. It's still difficult to understand, but not as much as the Penguin translation. And so, essentially what Kant is saying is that basically with the questions that we ask, we begin with these sets of principles, and with these sets of principles, we follow them. We follow them, and it is in this. I don't know. I shouldn't end the stream right now, just because I'm getting frustrated with my ability to try and figure shit out. It's par for the course of philosophy. You gotta figure shit out. I'm just worried that people are gonna get bored, but man, we got 0 people watching, so I don't gotta worry about that. I can take my sweet ass time with this. Nor is human reason to be blamed for this. It begins with principles which in the course of experience it must follow. Basically saying that in order to reason we have to start at a set of principles, and which seem sufficiently confirmed by experience. So he's basically saying that the principles that we start off with a set of principles when we reason, and those principles are to us seem to be confirmed by basically what we experience. With these again, according to the necessities of its nature, it rises higher and higher to more remote conditions. But when it perceives that in this way its work remains forever incomplete, because the questions never cease, it finds itself constrained to take refuge in principles which exceed every possible experimental application, and nevertheless seem so unobjectionable that even ordinary common sense agrees with them. Basically saying that when we arrive at the fact that there are certain questions that we can't answer with our own human reason, Oh, we got a viewer. Hello to the one person watching. This is going to be a very dry and very boring stream where we just read philosophy and analyze it the best I can. And basically, what Kant is saying in this little paragraph right here is that, and with our reason we start off with a set of principles, and with these principles we take that reason to greater and greater lengths. But because there's such a limit to how we can reason about things, we're inevitably going to feel very constrained about stuff. And so we fall back onto these principles that we have that seem like basic common sense, so to speak. I may be reading this wrong, but, if feel free to correct me if I'm wrong. Thus reason becomes involved in darkness and contradictions, from which no doubt it may conclude that errors must be lurking somewhere, but without being able to discover them, because the principles which it follows transcend all the limits of experience and withdraw themselves from all experimental tests. Yeah. So essentially what I'm taking Kant to say here is that because of the fact that there are things that reason cannot arrive at, and that there are things that we cannot answer as humans, and because we fall back onto these principles whenever we try to find reason in things that we cannot not reasonably reason, it's inevitably gonna be the case that reason is going to fall back onto a set of unclarity. I don't know if what I'm saying makes sense here, but basically what Kant is saying, and what I'm taking him to say, when he says reason becomes involved in darkness and contradictions, from which no doubt it may conclude that errors must be lurking somewhere, basically he's saying that because of the inability for us to find out certain truths of the world, to find questions that we can't answer, we're inevitably going to be grasping in the dark in a sense to try and find these things, without being able to discover them because the principles which it follows transcend all the limits of experience and withdraw themselves from all experimental tests. It is the battlefield of these endless controversies which is called metaphysics, and Kant is basically saying this whole paragraph is basically explaining how metaphysics came to be. Basically, to recap for the nth time, we have this set of principles that we start off with when we reason about things, and we follow these set of principles right up until the point where there's questions that cannot be answered, and there's things that we cannot answer with that reason. And so what we're essentially left to do is to scramble in the dark about these things, and thus that's what metaphysics is here for, to help us not scramble in the dark, so to speak. All right, continuing on with the next paragraph, and this first preface is going to be short, unlike the second preface, which goes on from page 7 to page. I know this one lasts forever. I think page 7 to page 23 for the second preface. We're in this for the long haul, ladies and gentlemen. There was a time when metaphysics held royal palace among all the sciences, and if the will were taken for the deed, the exceeding importance of her subject might well hold on, I'm going to get my bookmark. so that I can find out where, so that I can mark my book. Let me restart that paragraph. There was a time when metaphysic held a royal palace among all the sciences, and if the will were taken for the deed, the exceeding importance of her subject might well have secured her that place of honor. At present it is fashioned to despise metaphysic, and the poor matron, forlorn and forsaken, complains like Hecuba. Motto maxima rerum, tut generis nastique potens, nunc trahor exul in ops. That's Latin. That's Ovid Metamorphosis. Have not read it, but what Kant is saying is that there was a time when metaphysics was held in such a high regard. But in recent times, being 1781, it's become a lot more fashionable to shit on metaphysics, so to speak. To basically say we can do away with metaphysics completely. Maybe I'm exaggerating with that, but that's what I'm taking Kant to say. At first, the rule of metaphysics under the dominion of the dogmatists was despotic, but as the laws still bore the traces of an old barbarism, intestine wars and complete anarchy broke out, and the skeptics, a kind of nomads, despising all settled culture of the land, broke up from time to time all civil society. Fortunately, the number was small, and they could not prevent the old settlers from returning to cultivate the grounds afresh, though without any fixed plan or agreement. Okay, what I'm taking Kant to say here is that at the start when metaphysics had this high regard, or under people who were dogmatic about metaphysics, it basically had an iron grip on. It had this like iron grip on things, but as time went on, there was no real order to metaphysics as a science, which the whole project of Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, as I know it, is to basically establish a kind of metaphysical science, so to speak. There was basically a growing group of people who you're gonna get a lot of pauses to think. That's part of what makes this a bad content, so to speak. Alright, but as laws still bore traces of an old barbarism, intestine wars and complete anarchy broke out. And the skeptics, a kind of nomads, despising all settled culture of the land, broke up from time to time all civil society, basically saying that whatever order there was in the science of metaphysics kept getting broken up by these people, these skeptics of metaphysics. But essentially he's saying that because their numbers were small, they couldn't really do much with regards to affecting metaphysics as a science, so to speak. But continuing. Not long ago, one might have thought, indeed, that all these quarrels were to have been settled, and the legitimacy of her claims decided once for all through a certain physiology of the human understanding. The work of the celebrated Locke, that's John Locke, another philosopher I haven't read. But though the descent of that royal pretender, traced back as it had been to the lowest mob of common experience, ought to have rendered her claims very suspicious, yet as that genealogy turned out to be in reality a false invention, the old queen, metaphysic, continued to maintain her claims. Everything fell back into the old rotten dogmatism, and the contempt from which metaphysical science was to have been rescued remained the same as ever. This is to tie this back to the earlier paragraphs about human reason, basically saying that metaphysics, much like the general workings of human reason, basically ended up because of those trappings, falling back into like the old it ended up falling back on principles, so to speak. I'm saying so to speak a lot. It ended up basically just regurgitating old claims and without the order that the other sciences have, which Kant is probably going to get into later on. There is essentially not much to, I don't know. I'm sorry, I'm getting distracted a lot from the noise out there. I don't know if people can hear it, but again, there's a TV out there, it's being watched. It's kind of interrupting the thought processes, but I'll try my best. Old Queen Metaphysics continued to maintain her claims. Everything fell back into the old rotten dogmatism, and the contempt from which metaphysical science was to have been rescued remained the same as ever. At present, after everything has been tried, so they say, tried in vain, there reign in philosophy, wariness and complete indifferentism, the mother of chaos and night. Though at the same time we perceive the spring, at least the prelude of a near reform and of a new light, after ill-applied study has rendered everything dark, confused, and useless. Basically, Kant saying that look. I'm rereading this again just to see if I get the same basic idea. Okay, after everything has been tried, so they say in vain. There reign in philosophy wariness and complete indifferentism, the mother of chaos and night, though at the same time we perceive in the spring, or at least the prelude of a near reform, of a new light, after an ill-applied study has rendered everything dark, confused, and okay, I'm taking this to be him stating the project of kind of sort of the project of this book, which he's going to get into in the next paragraph. Basically saying, look, metaphysics is a fucking mess right now. Oh, there's too many claims being made that we cannot be certain about. And we cannot be indifferent about it. To continue. It is in vain to assume a kind of artificial indifferentism in respect to inquiries the object of which cannot be indifferent to human nature. Okay, basically saying that that's kind of stupid to assume that you have to be indifferent with regards to the object, with regards to like what he calls the object, with respect to inquiries, with respect to like how we question metaphysics and how we go about doing metaphysics. Nay, those pretended indifferentists, however they may try to disguise themselves by changing scholastic terminology into popular language, if they think at all, fall back inevitably into those very metaphysical dogmas which they profess to despise. Is like the little insult that Kant threw here, if they think at all. Didn't notice it the first time around. Nevertheless, this indifferentism, showing itself in the very midst of the most flourishing state of all sciences, and affecting those very sciences, the teachings of which, if they could be had, would be the last to be surrendered, is a phenomenon well worthy of our attention and consideration. Basically saying that, okay, we need to study why, we need to take a look at why people are indifferent about metaphysics, and why people aren't considering metaphysics a proper science. A hard science, as I said in the last stream. It is clearly the result not of the carelessness, but of the mature judgment of our age, which will no longer rest satisfied with the mere appearance of knowledge. and there's a footnote right here. We often hear complaints against the shallowness of thought in our own time and the decay of sound knowledge. But I do not see that sciences which rest on a solid foundation, such as mathematics, physics, etc., deserve this reproach in the least. Basically say. Okay, we often hear complaints against the shallowness of thought in our own time and the decay of sound knowledge, but I do not see that sciences would rest on a found self. Basically saying that we have people talk a lot in 1781 when I write this about how knowledge these days, philosophical knowledge, is basically gone on a bust. But I beg to differ, because we have maybe that's not what he's saying. He's saying people these days talk about how we don't have a good foundation for the knowledge that we have, but when we look at things like mathematics and physics, these are things that have very solid foundations to their thought. On the contrary, they maintain their old reputation of solidity, and with regard to physics, even surpass it. The same spirit would manifest itself in other branches of knowledge, if only their principles had first been properly determined. Till that is done, indifferentism and doubt, and ultimately severe criticism, are rather signs of honest thought. Our age is, in every sense of the word, the age of criticism, and everything must submit to it. Interesting little quote there. Our age is, in every sense of the word, the age of criticism, and everything must submit to it. Pretty good quote, I think. Religion, on the strength of its sanctity and law, on the strength of its majesty, try to withdraw themselves from it, but by so doing, they arouse just suspicions, and cannot claim that sincere respect which reason pays to those only who have been able to stand in its free and open examination. Kant doing a little critique of religion here, basically saying that religion is something that is on basically what he refers, if we're referring back to that paragraph about at first the rule of metaphysics, this dogmatism, this adherence to principles, and essentially that adherence to principle arises a lot of suspicion out of people. Well, when he says by doing so they arouse just suspicion and cannot claim that sincere respect which reason pays to those only who have been able to stand in its free and open examination. Continuing. It is at the same time a powerful appeal to reason to undertake anew the most difficult of its duties, namely self-knowledge, and to institute a court of appeal which should protect the just rights of reason. So this is the first time Kant's going to bring up the court analogy. Basically, Kant views this project like this. Pretend that the reader is a judge presiding over the case of how we can intuit reason, how we can intuit the things that we reason without experience. And Kant in this book is going to say, I am the lawyer, I'm going to present to you my case. I'm going to present to you my case for how we can, in fact, know things without experiencing them first. Okay, it is the most we should protect the just rights, but dismiss all groundless claims, and should do this not by means of irresponsible decrees, but according to the eternal and unalterable laws of reason. This court of appeal is no other but the critique of pure reason. Kant basically saying, here I'm going to present to you my case. This book, this critique of pure reason, this is going to be my case to you. I do not mean by this a criticism of books and systems, but of the faculty of reason in general, touching that the whole class of knowledge, which it may strive after, unassisted by experience. Basically saying, okay, when I say critique, I'm not talking about, analyzing and criticizing a book or a movie or a system in power, but rather I'm going to basically examine and look at how we intuit things. What he says, that whole class of knowledge which it may strive after, unassisted by experience, how we intuit what we know without experiencing it first. This must decide the question of the possibility or impossibility of metaphysics in general, and the determination of its sources, its extent and its limits, and all this according to fixed principles. Interesting. So essentially Kant here is saying that the whole project of this book is to basically decide say whether or not metaphysics as a whole can be considered a hard science like mathematics or physics. And what the purpose of this book is to basically examine that entire field and look at it through the lens of what things we can know without experience. I'm probably going to be repeating myself a lot here, but is what it is. This, the only way that was left, I have followed, and I flatter myself that I have thus removed all those errors which have hitherto brought reason, being unassisted by experience, into conflict with itself. Basically, Kant giving himself a pat on the back for doing such a good job with writing this book. I have not evaded its questions by pleading the insufficiency of human reason, but I have classified them according to principles, and, after showing the point where reason begins to misunderstand itself, solved them satisfactorily. Basically saying, okay, look, I've done all the reasoning in my head, I've put it down into writing, and I think that the answers that you're going to find in this book are going to be satisfactory. It is true that the answer of those questions is not such as a dogma-enamored curiosity might wish for such curiosity could not have been satisfied except by juggling tricks in which I am no adept. But this is not in the natural intention of our reason, and it became the duty of philosophy to remove the deception which arose from a false interpretation, even though many a vaunted and cherished dream should vanish at the same time. Basically saying the entire purpose of philosophy is to make clear errors in thinking. In this work, I have chiefly aimed at completeness, and I venture to maintain that there ought not to be one single metaphysical problem that has not been solved here. Essentially saying that you put in plain English, he wants to basically solve metaphysics, which is kind of self-evident, or to the solution of which the key has not been supplied. In fact, pure reason is so perfect a unity that if its principle should prove insufficient to answer any one of the many questions started by its very nature, one might throw it away altogether, as insufficient to answer the other questions with perfect certainty. Basically saying, if you don't think that my answer is sufficient enough, basically just toss it out. While I am saying this, I fancy I observe in the face of my readers an expression of indignation mixed with contempt and pretensions apparently so self-glorious and extravagant, and yet they are in reality far more moderate than those made by the writer of the commonest essay professing to prove the simple nature of the soul, or the necessity of a first beginning of the world. For while he pretends to extend human knowledge beyond the limits of all possible experience, I confess most humbly that this is entirely beyond my power. I mean only to treat of reason and its pure thinking, a knowledge of which it's not very far to seek, considering that it is to be found within myself. Common logic gives an instance how all these simple acts of reason can be enumerated completely and systematically. My question is, what can we hope to achieve with reason when all the material and assistance of experience is taken away? That last little sentence is him basically stating the question of the book. Like, what can we do with reason when all of our experience is taken away? If we cannot experience anything at all, how can we reason? So what is the foundation of our reason, basically? So much with regard to the completeness in our laying hold of every single object, and thoroughness in our laying hold of all objects, as the material of our critical inquiries. A completeness determined, not by casual idea, but by the nature of knowledge itself. And thus ends the first premise. I will say, the clarity in this edition of a Critique of Pure Reason or at least the segments of the Critique of Pure Reason that are in this book. I am liking the clarity a lot. It's helping out the reading a lot better than a lot more than I think the Penguin edition has. So, yeah, I think I'm coming away with this with more stronger, confident interpretations of things. At least from what I can tell. So, there's that. Alright, now we go to the preface to the second edition, 1787. Whether the treatment of that class of knowledge with which reason is occupied follows the secure method of a science or not, can easily be determined by the result. If, after repeating preparations, it comes to a standstill as soon as its real goal is approached, or is obliged, in order to reach it, to retrace its steps again and again, and strike into fresh paths. Again, if it is impossible to produce unanimity among those who are engaged with the same work as to the manner in which their common object should be attained, we may be convinced that such a study is far from having attained to the secure method of a science, but is only groping in the dark. Holy run-on sentence, Batman. Okay, let me try and break this down in a way that is not as long-winded as that. Basically, how we treat knowledge, as far as reason is concerned, is whether or not there's a specific method to it, a scientific method, so to speak. And if something can't really follow the scientific method, no matter how hard we try to repeat that process, then we can't reasonably consider it a science. Yes. And that field of study that we have is only really just, like Kant says, groping in the dark, just trying to grasp at something that isn't there. Yeah. In that case, we are conferring a great benefit on reason. If we only find out the right method, though many things should have to be surrendered as useless, which were comprehended in the original aim that had been chosen without sufficient reason. That logic, from the earliest times, has followed that secure method may be seen from the fact that since Aristotle, it has not had to retrace a single step, unless we choose to consider as improvements the removal of some unnecessary subtleties, or the clearer definition of its matter, both of which refer to the elegance rather than to the solidity of the science, basically saying that the entire field of logic, ever since Aristotle, has basically remained unchanged since Aristotle, because it has been codified as a science. It is remarkable also that to the present day it has not been able to make one step in advance, so that, to all appearance, it may be considered as completed and perfect. If some modern philosophers thought to enlarge it by introducing psychological chapters on the different faculties of knowledge, faculty of imagination, wit, etc., or metaphysical chapters on the origin of knowledge, or the different degrees of certainty according to the difference of objects, idealism, skepticism, etc., or lastly anthropological chapters on prejudices, their causes and remedies, this could only arise from their ignorance of the peculiar nature of logical science. We do not enlarge, but we only disfigure the sciences if we allow their respective limits to be confounded. Basically Kant saying that there has to be limits, that there has to be necessary limits with regards to sciences, is in order to make them comprehensive and easy to understand. And the limits of logic are definitely fixed by the fact that it is a science, which has nothing to do but fully to exhibit and strictly to prove all formal rules of thought, whether it be a priori or empirical, whatever be its origin or its object, and whatever be the impedance, accidental or natural, which it has to encounter in the human mind. So let's talk about this word a priori really quickly. This is going to come up a lot in Kant. When Kant says a priori, he basically means it's basically a way to denote things that can be known before we experience them. And so when he makes the distinction of a priori and empirical, he's basically saying, okay, there's a distinction between what we can know before we experience it and after we experience it, and the empirical is basically what we can know after it's been experienced. That logic should in this respect have been so successful is due entirely to its limitation, whereby it is not only the right but the duty to make abstraction of all the objects of knowledge and their differences, so that the understanding has to deal with nothing beyond itself and its own forms. It was far more difficult, of course, for reason to enter on the secure method of science, considering that it has to deal with not with itself only, but also with objects. Logic, therefore, has a kind of preparation, propedeutic form, as it were, the vestibule of sciences only, where real knowledge is concerned and is presupposed for critical purposes, while the acquisition of knowledge must be sought for in the sciences themselves, properly and subjectively called. Giant paragraph long run-on sentence. This is going to be, or two giant paragraph long run-on sentences. This is going to be a thing we're going to see with Kant a lot. He practically talks in run-on sentences. But let's try to pick apart what the arguments is generally in this paragraph. That logic should in this respect have been so successful is due entirely to its limitation, basically saying that the reason why logic is a science in the first place is because of the limitations that we have placed upon it, whereby it has not only the right but the duty to make abstraction of all of the objects of knowledge and their differences, so that the understanding has to deal with nothing beyond itself and its own forms. I'm basically saying that logic as a science has basically become so neat and so defined that we basically that it doesn't really have to deal with anything outside of itself. It was far more difficult, of course, for reason to enter on the secure method of science, considering that it has to deal not with itself only, but also with objects. Okay. This is where I'm starting to get this is where I'm starting to kind of go, with this, because I'm not entirely sure what Kant means by this. God, if only Pippa were up right now, they could probably help me. That or maybe President Sunday, who came in the chat one time. Who's to say he's gonna come in the chat again? It was far more difficult, of course, for reason to enter the secure method of science. considering it. Okay, basically saying that reason is that it's a lot harder for reason to basically be considered science or metaphysics. That things dealing with reason have a harder time trying to become a science, because they have to deal not only with the fact that they have not only with the thing with the reason itself, but also with things outside of reason. Logic, therefore, as a kind of propedeutic forms, as it were, the vestibule of the sciences only, and where real knowledge is concerned, is presupposed for critical purposes, while the acquisition of knowledge must be sought after for in the sciences themselves, properly and objectively so called. Continuing. If there is to be in those sciences an element of reason, something in them must be known a priori, right, again, before experience, and knowledge may stand in a twofold relation to its subject, either by simply determining it and its concept, which must be supplied from elsewhere, or by making it real. Basically saying that there's two things. There's two things we have to know about something in order for that something to be a science. It has to be, the things about it have to be known before we can experience it. That's it. And then that's it. And that we basically need to know thing in two ways. Either one by simply knowing, as Kant says, determining it and its concept. Basically saying we need to simply know. We simply need to make determinations of it. Or by making it real. Or basically saying that we either determine something. We know something basically by determining that it's real or by making it real. If I'm reading that correctly, I might be getting a misreading of that. The former is theoretical, the latter practical knowledge of reason. In both the pure part, namely that in which reason determines its object entirely a priori, whether it contain much or little, must be treated first without mixing up with it what comes from other sources. For it is bad economy to spend blindly whatever comes in, and not to be able to determine whether, when there is a stoppage, which part of the income can bear the expenditure, and where reductions must be made. So basically saying that with regards to the types of knowledge that we have, and the knowledge of determination is the theoretical knowledge, and the knowledge of making it real is a practical knowledge of reason. In both the pure part, namely that in which reason determines its object entirely a priori, whether it contain much or little, must be treated first without mixing up what comes other sources. And so in this paragraph, he basically compares knowledge. He can basically compare knowledge and reasoning to spending habits. He's basically saying, look, it's bad for you to spend your money just because you have it, right? It's kind of the same thing with knowledge. We can't just say that we know things just blindly. We have to have a foundation for the things that we know, and the whole goal of this book is basically to establish those foundations. Mathematics and physics are the two theoretical sciences of reason which have to determine in their objects a priori. The former quite purely, the latter partially so, and partially from other sources of knowledge besides reason. Basically saying that the two type that math and physics basically with with their entire project determine how they arrive at things a priori or before experience. I'll get into why I disagree with that in a moment, but you know what, fuck it, I'll get into it right now. So, essentially, so let's start with the argument here. The argument from Kant is that with math and physics, these are things that are born outside of whatever human involvement there is in the construction of math and physics. But that's not necessarily true, I think. Because when we talk about math and physics, we're more or less talking about formulas, concepts, things that we have applied to concepts that we would not know without those things applied to them. And so, with regards to mathematics, if you asked me 2 plus 2, if you said 2 plus 2 equals 4, and I asked you to prove it, well, you'd say, okay, they have 2. Well, if you count numerically from 2, you go 1, 2, that's 4. And I said, okay, but can you prove that that's necessarily the case? And they'll go, okay, the sum of 2 is 1 and 1. And if we add the sum of 1 and 1 together and add another sum of 1 and 1, we'll get 4. And I said, okay, but how do we prove that? Well, we can go infinitely with this, basically, until we have divided until we have divided 2 plus 2 equals 4 into an infinite series of infinitely small numbers, all of which add up to 4. There's essentially an infinite number of ways that we can make 4, or from 2 plus 2, if that makes sense. Mathematics, from the earliest times to which the history of human reason can reach, has followed among that wonderful people of the Greeks the safe way of a science. But it must not be supposed that it was as easy for mathematics as for logic, in which reason is concerned with itself alone, to find or rather to make for itself the royal road. I believe, on the contrary, that there is a long period of tentative work, chiefly still among the Egyptians, that the change is to be ascribed to a revolution, produced by the happy thought of a single man, whose experiment pointed unmistakably to the path that had to be followed, and opened and traced out from the most distant times the safe way of a science. Okay. Sorry, I got a little bit distracted. Let's reread that again, shall we? Mathematics, from the earliest times to which the history of human reason can reach, has followed, among that wonderful people of Greece, the safe way of a science. Okay? But it must not be supposed that it was as easy for mathematics as for logic, in which reason is concerned with itself alone, to find or rather to make for itself that royal road. I believe, on the contrary, that there was a long period of tentative work, chiefly still among the Egyptians, and that the change is to be ascribed to a revolution produced by the happy thought of a single man, whose experiment pointed unmistakably to the path that had to be followed, and opened and traced out from the most distant times the safe way of a science. Okay. Basically saying, to the one person watching currently, let me see if they've chatted anything. Nope. Alright, let's continue. I believe, on the contrary, that there was a long period of tentative work, and that change is to be ascribed to a revolution produced by the happy thought of a single man, whose experiment pointed unmistakably to the path that had to be followed, and opened and traced out from the most distant times the safe way of science. The history of that intellectual revolution, which was far more important than the discovery of the passage round the celebrated Cape of Good Hope, and the name of its fortune author, have not been preserved to us. But the story preserved by Diogenes and Laertius, who names the reputed author of the smallest elements of ordinary geometrical dimension, even of such as, according to general opinion, do not require to be proved, shows at all events that the memory of the revolution, produced by the very first traces of the discovery of a new method, appeared extremely important to the mathematicians and thus remained unforgotten. Okay, I think I get what Kant's basically saying with the whole revolution thing. Basically describing revolution as, like, knowledge that is innate to the world, that is innate to us regardless of experience. That he's essentially describing a revolution as the discovery of a priori knowledge, if I'm reading correctly. A new light flashed on the first man who had demonstrated the properties of the isosceles triangle, whether his name was Thales or any other name. Thales being Thales of Miletus, the guy who is often considered one of the first philosophers out there. He basically had the theory that everything was made out of water. For he found that he had not to investigate what he saw in the figure, or the mere concept of that figure, and thus to learn of its properties, but that he had to produce his knowledge by means of what he had himself according to concepts a priori, placed into that figure and represented by construction, so that in order to know anything with certainty a priori, he must not attribute to that figure anything beyond what it necessarily follows for what he has himself placed onto it, in accordance with that concept. Okay, let's review what we just learned here. Basically, Kant is giving the example of the isosceles triangle, saying that what we know about an isosceles triangle, the properties of an isosceles triangle, the concept of an isosceles triangle, etc., was all a priori knowledge, which I might be I may be doing severe misreadings of Kant here, but I don't know. Blame Kant for not knowing how to write a book. Or me. It took a much longer time before physics entered on the highway of science, for no more than a century and a half has elapsed since the ingenious proposal of Bacon partially initiated that discovery, partly as others were already on the right track, gave a new impetus to it. A discovery which, like the former, can only be explained by a rapid intellectual revolution. In what I have to say, I shall confine myself to natural science so far as it is founded on empirical principles. When Galilei let balls of a particular weight, which he had determined himself, rolled down an inclined plane, or Torricelli made the air carry a weight which he had previously determined to be equal to that of a definite volume of water, or when in later times Stahl, I am not closely following here the course of history and the experimental method, nor are the first beginnings of it very well known, changed metal into lime and lime again into metals, lime basically not referring to like literal limes, but the fruit, but more so limes as in like limestone, I think. Or maybe not limestone, some different element. By withdrawing and restoring something, a new light flashed on all students of nature. They comprehended that reason has insight into that only which she herself produces on her own plan, and that she must move forward with the principles of her judgments according to fixed law, and compel nature to answer her questions, but not let herself be led by nature, as it were in leading strings, because otherwise accidental observations made on no previously fixed plan will never converge towards necessary law. Basically, Kant here is saying that there has to be fixed laws with regards to how we determine reasoning things and going about things. Going about making a science, so to speak. Will never converge towards the necessary law, which is the only thing that reason seeks and requires. Reason, in holding in one hand its principles, according to which concordant phenomena alone can be admitted as laws of nature, and in the other hand, the experiment, which it has devised according to those principles, must approach nature in order to be taught by it, but not in the character of a pupil who agrees to everything the master likes, but as an appointed judge, again with the court metaphor, who compels the witness to answer the questions which he himself proposes. Therefore, even the science of physics entirely owes the beneficial revolution of its character to the happy thought that we ought to seek in nature, and not import into it by means of fiction, whatever reason must learn from nature, and could not know by itself, that we must do this in accordance with what reason itself has originally placed into nature. Thus, only has the study of nature entered on the secure method of science, after having for so many centuries done nothing but grope in the dark. Basically explaining the history of scientific reason, and basically saying that it started out as just mere groping in the dark before eventually developing itself into becoming a hard science by arriving at a priori conclusions that are inherent to that science. Metaphysic, a completely isolated and speculative science of reason, which declines all teaching of experience and rests on the concepts only, not in their application to intuition as mathematics, in which reason therefore is meant to be her own pupil, has hitherto not been so fortunate as to enter on the secure path of a science, although it is older than all other sciences and would remain even if all the rest were swallowed up in the abyss of an all-destroying barbarism. Oh, Jesus, again, another run-on sentence. God damn it, Kant, write shorter sentences. Why am I asking him to write shorter sentences? He's been fucking dead for centuries. Regardless, write shorter sentences. Jesus Christ, philosophers and their fucking grammar. Let's reread that again. Metaphysic, a completely isolated and speculative science of reason, which declines all teaching of experience and rests on concepts only, not in their application to intuition as mathematics, in which reason is therefore meant to be her own pupil, has hitherto not been so fortunate as to enter on the secure path of science. Basically saying that metaphysics isn't a science yet. Could have said that. Again, he could have said it without doing the fucking run-on sentences, but, Kant will do how Kant will do. Although it is older than all other sciences, and would remain even if all the rest were swallowed up in the abyss of an all-destroying barbarism. In metaphysic, reason, even if it tries only to understand a priori as it pretends to do, those laws which are confirmed by the commonest experience is constantly brought to a standstill, and we are obliged again and again to retrace our steps because they do not lead us to where we want to go. Basically saying that the reasoning that we've used to try to find out, a priori truths about reason haven't been satisfactory, and we basically have to again and again and again and again and try to find the reasons which they are a priori. Those laws which are confirmed by the commonest experience... I lost my spot. Because they do not lead us where we want to go. While as to any unanimity among those who are engaged in the same work, there is so little of it in metaphysic that it has rather become an area specially destined, it would seem, for those who wish to exercise themselves in mock fights, and where no combatant has as yet succeeded in gaining an inch of ground that he could call permanently its own. It cannot be denied, therefore, that the method of metaphysic has hitherto consisted in groping only, and what is the worst, in groping among mere concepts. basically saying that the current state of metaphysics right now is one in which there's just constant groping in the dark, like Kant would say, that there isn't really much in the way of metaphysics right now of arriving at these a priori conclusions that would make it a sound science. What then can be the cause that hitherto no secure method of science has been discovered? Shall we say that it is impossible? Then why should nature have visited our reason with restless aspiration to look for it? As if it were the most important concern. Basically saying, is it impossible to label metaphysics as science? And if it's impossible, then why do we continue to try to do it? Nay, more, how little should we be justified in trusting our reason if, with regard to one of the most important objects we wish to know, it not only abandons us, but lures us on by vain hopes and in the end betrays us? Or, if hitherto we have only failed to meet with the right path, what indications are there to make us hope that, if we renew our researches, we shall be more successful than others before us? The examples of mathematics... Actually, I'm going to use the restroom, because I got to poo. I will be back shortly. Hopefully somebody joins in and doesn't leave. Immediately. back to the reading at hand. The examples of mathematics and natural science, which by one revolution have become what they are now, seem to me sufficiently remarkable to induce us to consider what may have been the essential element in that intellectual revolution which has proved so beneficial to them, and to make the experiment at least so far as beneficial to them, so far as the analogy between them as sciences of reason with metaphysic allows it of imitating them. Jesus Christ, Kant. Write easier sentences to understand. But let's try to understand it. The example of mathematics and natural science, which by one revolution have become what they now are, seem to me sufficiently remarkable to induce us to consider what may have been the essential element in that intellectual revolution which has proved so beneficial to them. Basically asking, what we should consider what is essential to math and natural science that makes them sciences, and to make the experiment, at least so far as the analogy between them as sciences of reason with metaphysic allows it of imitating them. I still don't understand this last part, but you're never gonna understand shit completely on a first read. Hitherto, it has been supposed that all our knowledge must conform to the objects, but under that supposition, all elements to establish anything about them a priori by means of concepts, and thus to enlarge our knowledge, have come to nothing. Hitherto it is supposed that all our knowledge must conform to the objects, but under that supposition, all attempts to establish anything about them a priori by means of concepts, and thus to enlarge our knowledge, have come to nothing. The experiment therefore ought to be made whether we should not succeed better with the problems of metaphysics by assuming that the objects must conform to our mode of cognition. For this would better agree with the demanded possibility of an a priori knowledge of them, which is to settle something about objects before they are given us. The experiment therefore ought to be made. I'm not gonna pretend to understand this shit, but we can try. We can try to understand it. Let's go back to the sentence. Hitherto it has been supposed that all our knowledge must conform to the objects. Alright, I'm particularly interested in this part. All attempts to establish anything about them a priori by means of concepts, and thus to enlarge our knowledge, have come to nothing. This is the part that I'm interested in trying to figure out what it's saying. All attempts to establish... Because I think I know what he's trying to say, but I can't quite put it to words. The experiment therefore ought to be made whether we should not succeed better with the problems of metaphysics, but by assuming that the objects must conform to our mode of cognition, for this would better agree with the demanded possibility of an a priori knowledge of them, which is to settle something about objects before they are given us. I'm struggling to find out what Kant means by this. Maybe somebody in the comments could help. Maybe somebody in chat could help. I don't know. Continuing. We have here the same case as with the first thought of Copernicus, who, not being able to get on in the explanation of the movements of the heavenly bodies, as long as he assumed that all the stars turned around the spectator, tried whether he could not succeed better by assuming the spectator to be turning round, and the star is to be at rest. Basically explaining how Copernicus arrived at the conclusion that the Earth revolved around the Sun and not the Sun revolved around the Earth. A similar experiment may be tried in metaphysics, so far as the intuition of objects is concerned. If the intuition had to conform to the constitution of objects, I do not see how we could know anything of it a priori. But if the object, as an object of the senses, conform to the constitution of our faculty of intuition, I can very well conceive such a possibility. As, however, I cannot rest in these intuitions, if they are to become knowledge, but I have to refer to them as representations, to something as their object, and must determine that object by them, I have the choice of admitting either that the concepts by which I carry out that determination conform to the object, being then again and in the same perplexity on account of the manner how I can know anything about it a priori. Again with the run-on sentences, Kant, Jesus Christ, or that the objects, or what is the same, the experience in which they alone are known as given objects, must conform to these concepts. I'm just going to put a big old question mark right there. As far as I cannot see the rest of these intuitions, if they are to become knowledge, okay, I think we're arriving at the point where my brain is just farting out. So I'll put a bookmark here. Come back to it later. And yeah, I'll see all one of you later. Or all 0 of you later. Goodbye.